Our minds are running a million miles an hour. We're very passionate, we're very powerful. We're not docile and just will do whatever to please anyone.
Are young women becoming politically radicalised?
I think it's almost like a fight back, just like to be radical back instead of be polite and kind and, understanding and caring. They want to be the powerful ones, the ones that are radical.
It's not a question you hear very often. It was young men and their shift towards Reform UK that hit the headlines at the last general election. But there was another story unfolding almost unnoticed about what happened to the ordinary young women they grew up with.
I've never been so angry. I remember sending videos to my friends afterwards, literally shaking, nearly crying.
In July 2024, under 24s went in different directions. Men this age were twice as likely as their female peers to vote Reform. But in turn, young women were twice as likely as young men to vote Green. Since then, if anything, that shift has intensified.
As women, we're sort of socialised into being more compassionate and empathetic. So we're sort of forced to move further to the left to actually have the things that we care about represented.
An average of 4 polls carried out this autumn for the research group More in Common, polling around 2,000 people each time, put the Greens in the lead among women under 30. That's a party whose last manifesto proposed a wealth tax on assets over £10 million, a 4-day working week, an end to the hostile environment for refugees, and which has recently committed to phasing out private landlords. A big issue for younger members. Ciara Elaine is co-chair of Young Greens.
It feels incredibly insecure. People don't know if they're going to be able to afford next month's rent. I mean, you're spending your entire paycheck for a tiny, tiny flat that has mould or that the ceiling's dripping.
This documentary explores what's driving that change, why it's gained so little attention, and what it means for the future. I'm Gaby Hinsliff, a Guardian columnist and former political editor of The Observer, and this is Left Out, the political radicalisation of young women and the silence surrounding it. We wanted to know more about how this demographic sees politics. So we met with young women supported by the charity Young Women's Trust, others at this year's Green Party conference, and also with students and sixth formers in Bristol, a diverse and traditionally left-leaning city. They don't represent every young woman in the country, they couldn't, but they do shed some light on why many feel mainstream politics isn't working for them.
My name's Liberty Cheeseman.
My name is Yasmin Akbas. So I'm Ella Ritchie-Dixon.
My name is Bethy Azraz.
The rise in right-wing extremism is very concerning, and gender inequality.
Climate change, I feel like it's definitely being brushed under the rug.
Getting a job definitely stresses me out. Getting a house stresses me out a lot.
I worked as a specialist mentor for mental health at a university, but it was 0-hour contracts. I ended up struggling with my own mental health because I couldn't afford my bills.
How far do these young women reflect the broader picture? Dr. Elizabeth Loose is Research and Engagement Manager for the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, which focuses on politics and younger people. Its 2025 youth poll surveyed 2,616 to 29-year-olds in the UK on their political opinions and interests, and found some differences between the genders.
We asked young people to place themselves on a scale from 1 to 10 on a left-right scale. And whereas most of men and women put themselves in the centre, which I always find quite important to point out, we did see slight divergences on the left and the right. So young men put themselves on the left side of the spectrum 13% of the time, whereas young women put themselves 20% of the time. So a bit more left-leaning there among women. And on the right, it was the opposite. Young men put themselves there 26% of the time, and only 15% of the women did. And we've kind of see that tendency through quite a lot of the data that came in.
Which specific issues are young women most concerned about when they're voting?
We're seeing similarities here, but also slight differences. So for young men, inflation and cost of living is top, then healthcare, crime, housing affordability, and immigration and asylum. Whereas for young women, it's healthcare, inflation, the cost of living, housing affordability, mental health, and crime. So we can see here mental health not only shows up for women, but in the top 5. Reversely, for young men, immigration and asylum seem to be more important.
Immigration definitely came up in our interviews. Some found the tone of debate about it alienating. Others found recent street protests alarming.
Near my house, they just built a whole building of apartments for immigrants and there was flags everywhere. I just felt so horrible about it.
And yes, we saw the flags pop out outside of my house. I've never been so angry.
My name is Chloe Gadget. When the Lionesses won the game, why didn't you put flags up? The place where I live, there's a Chinese takeaway and someone painted the British flag like right outside of it and started abusing the owner.
I'm Ibtihal. I come from an immigrant family. I guess that's why I've been so focused on politics lately. I mean, the fear of what would happen if a party that's so against specific types of people came into establishment.
Our conversations match the data that suggests overall young people disenchanted with mainstream politics have been moving in different directions, with young women noticeably more liberal. Rosie Campbell is a professor of politics at King's College London, specialising in gender and voting behaviour, political participation and representation. I asked her whether this kind of split is new to British politics.
In the period that we've had good data, so in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, women were slightly more likely to vote for the Conservatives than men. And then by the 1970s, that gap largely disappeared. But when we got to the 2017 election, the traditional gap reversed and actually more women voted Labour, more men voted Conservative. And that was also true in 2019. 2024 was a little bit different.
That data comes from the British Electoral Study, and it looks like there was a shift at the last election. Although overall more women voted for the main parties than men did, around a quarter of women aged 18 to 25 voted Green, twice as many as young men. What was driving that change?
My suspicion is, although this has only been happening very recently, so it's hard to get the good quality data that allows us to really examine this in detail, that the trends that are pushing young men to the right might equally be pushing young women to the left.
Is it young women driving that polarisation, or is it men?
If we look, for example, at reform support in the last election, men overall were more likely to support reform. But when we look inside the generations, young women were significantly more likely to support Green than older women. So I do think that we pay a lot of attention to young men, but actually it might be young women that are moving faster.
And that's not unique to Britain. In the US presidential elections, Donald Trump had a 14-point lead over Kamala Harris among men under 29. Harris was 18 points ahead among women the same age. In Germany's federal elections, 35% of women under 24 voted for the left-wing Die Linke party, compared to only 14% of men their age. This generation of voters, known as Gen Z, grew up in the aftermath of the 2008 global banking crash and then through a global pandemic. Could those life experiences have shaped their politics? We asked Scarlett Maguire, the founder of UK political polling consultancy Merlin Strategy.
I just did some polling of younger people, for example, that showed that the younger generation thought they were going to be worse off than their parents, which is sort of heartbreaking, thinking they're growing up at a time that should be sort of optimistic about their future. But I think what that does is probably reinforce certain ideas about whose team you are and aren't on, which I think can lead to increased polarisation. I think what's also interesting is we're starting to see many more young women than men attend university, for example, because one of the biggest driving forces in how people vote and in their political opinions is how educated they are.
Scarlett Maguire and Professor Campbell mentioned something else, the way young people get their political content. Typically for Gen Z, that's social media. And the algorithms these platforms use to push content into our feeds are geared to give each of us more of what we seem to like. If young men and young women are living in separate online worlds, could that help explain why they're moving further apart in real life? Keir Starmer only joined TikTok in December, after we recorded these interviews. So whose content was cutting through for our young women?
I did find out about Jeremy Corbyn's party as an advertisement on Instagram.
I'm Cara Zach, the Green Party leader. A lot of his speeches are coming up more and more. I remember when I had TikTok, I followed Zara Sultana.
She just constantly spoke out about how women are treated, Gaza, immigration issues.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. The enemy of the working class travels by private jet, not migrant dinghy.
I remember just looking at her videos, her talking in Parliament and speaking in a way that I feel really related to me.
When I look at my social media, especially on Instagram, I am followed by a lot of young women. They see in me a young woman who might look like them, might sound like them, and is also talking about issues that they really care about.
Zara Sultana is the MP for Coventry South. She left the Labour Party in July to co-found a new left-wing project, Your Party, which she said would be socialist, anti-imperialist, anti-NATO. It hasn't gone entirely smoothly, but Sultana has 500,000 followers on TikTok, and name recognition many party leaders would kill for. So how important are her social media channels to her?
They're really important. The way we learn about what's happening around the world has massively changed. Young people are less likely to go out and buy a newspaper. They're less likely to probably watch BBC Question Time. They are more likely to be scrolling on their phones. And I think it's about understanding that as politicians, we have to be in all of those spaces.
Sultana isn't the only radical left politician who's big on TikTok. Zach Polanski, the new Green leader elected this October, has a strong social media presence.
Why is everything so shit? Our wages are shit.
500,000 workers protesting over pay, jobs
and then there's Zoran Mamdani, the Socialist Democrat mayor-elect of New York, whose famously viral videos are now popping up in British feeds.
You're worried about a 33-year-old becoming mayor of New York City. And I want you to know I hear you. That's why this weekend I'll be making a change. I'm turning 34.
His victory as a pro-immigrant, rent-freezing, overtly left-wing candidate, albeit in liberal New York, has given British left-wing activists hope. According to youth participation research group Circle, part of Tufts University, young women were much more likely to support Mamdani than young men, 82% versus 65%. I wanted to know more about young women's relationships with social media. Rosalind Gill is Professor of Inequalities in Media, Culture and Creative Industries at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her most recent study found young women often feel judged online and anxious about saying the right thing. Does this extend to their political opinions?
Very much so, yes. I mean, some of the interviews I conducted at the beginning were undertaken just after the murder of George Floyd and the kind of reanimation resurgence of Black Lives Matter activism. And the young women were extremely concerned about having the right kind of politics, but also not being seen to be purely virtue signalling or purely being performative. They genuinely wanted to educate themselves and get it right on that issue.
From what you see of political parties' messaging, do you think they're taking this demographic seriously enough?
I simply don't think that they take young women's concerns seriously. And young women are talking about things like period poverty or the likely unaffordability of childcare for them, gender identity, different ways of identifying sexually, racism. They're talking about their bodies, all of these things. These really, really matter to young women. And they underestimate young women at their peril because young women are really interested in politics, maybe not with a capital P, but they're really animated by these questions.
Whether it's politics with a small p or a big P, the Greens are another progressive party capturing the attention of this demographic.
I've certainly noticed a rise in young women stopping me in the street and telling me how grateful they are for the leadership that I've been providing politically, which is incredibly touching. And often those young women are saying that in a way that clearly it means quite a lot to them, and they've been feeling quite let down by politics at large.
Carla Denyer is the Green MP for Bristol Central and former co-leader of the party. When I met her at this year's party conference, I asked her what was driving younger women to the Greens. She talked about the impact of austerity on their lives and financial prospects, but she mentioned something else too.
Sadly, probably a big one is the growing misogyny in society is pushing women towards seeking out a party that is actively challenging that and is fighting for an alternative. Ever since the Me Too movement, I feel like that's been a factor.
Our young women certainly had strong feelings about what they saw as rising misogyny, hatred towards women, which they increasingly witnessed in their online worlds. And they also talked about their everyday lived experience of sexual harassment. More than 3/4 of women aged 18 to 24 have felt unsafe in a public space due to the actions or behaviour of a man or men. This is according to a survey published in December by the Agnolini Inquiry into Sexual Violence, commissioned after the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer.
I think it's intimidating and scary the way that the divide is at the moment. There's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of violence against women, and it seems to be regressing, in my opinion.
Personally, my first experience with sexual harassment, I was 11. I feel like recently it's been happening when I'm walking to the library, when I'm walking to school, in the middle of the day, makeup, no makeup, baggy clothes, not baggy clothes. I'm catching myself checking who's cycling behind me when I'm cycling home at 3 p.m.
Listening to stories like this made me wonder how far sexual politics, the debate over consent, predatory behaviour or so-called toxic masculinity, influences the Westminster kind. One study across 30 countries by Ipsos UK and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London this year found Gen Z more divided than older generations over questions like whether feminism has gone so far that men are now the victims of discrimination. Could that help explain young men and women's diverging political views, with both looking for parties they think will defend their interests? Some of our interviewees clearly feared a backlash against women's rights.
I'm Samara Aiden. In America, you see the right wings, they won, right? They banned abortion. So here they're probably going to think, oh, if they win, later down in the line, the right is going to be taken away from us.
If you're put in a position where you're having to have a baby that you don't want, where you're financially unable to have a baby, that puts you in a horrible, horrible position. And I just worry that that is potentially something that could happen.
In her research, Professor Gill also found young women complaining of what she called a gulf of understanding between them and their male peers over misogyny.
I think just looking to the future, what I sense is an increasing sense of kind of hetero-pessimism and hetero-fatalism among young women. And that's a sense of pessimism and hopelessness about heterosexual relationships, a kind of strong disappointment with men.
I think it's because they don't see how anything would affect them. That's why they don't take it seriously.
Hi, I'm Danica. When you bring up issues of within women or immigrants or things like that, they just find it funny.
With Greta Thunberg, I remember being in year 7 and she was talking about climate change, and all the boys in the classroom were sat there ridiculing it, and the women on the other side were writing poems about how we believed in climate change.
Our interviewees clearly felt strongly about not being taken seriously. Back in September, Zara Sultana said she had felt excluded from some decision-making in your party by what she called a sexist boys' club. I asked her how she thought young women who might have supported your party would have taken that.
I think they would have been really disappointed to hear that from me as someone who has also called out Islamophobia and sexism within the Labour Party. And unfortunately, women have experienced this in their own workplaces and in their own lives. So that would have been yet another reminder that as women, we continue to face these issues. But it's really important that we speak up about these issues when we experience them.
Do you still feel there's a sexist boys' club in the party?
I feel that we have to dismantle misogyny and sexism in all aspects of society. And until we have the socialist utopia that I dream of, where all injustices are addressed, it is an ongoing issue.
So if alternatives to the established parties have their problems too, is there anything mainstream parties can do to win young women back? Some of our young interviewees warmed to Labour in 2024, but now feel let down.
It did seem like they did want to improve the cost of living, inflation, and it only seems to be getting worse. And it has put me off a little bit voting for Labour in the future.
I was excited to hear that they'd won, but then now I'm not seeing any benefits.
Rosie Writing is the Labour MP for Kettering. Elected last year at the age of 26, she's the youngest female MP in the Commons. With polling indicating the Greens are now comfortably ahead of Labour among under-24s, I spoke to her from her busy Westminster office and asked her why she thinks this is.
I think people want change very quickly, particularly younger people, probably because they understand more than anyone the urgency of needing change. This country needs to feel more equal. Because I speak to my friends or young people in my constituency at the moment who have literally written off the idea of home ownership, and we need to change that. You know, the planning and infrastructure bill, building 1.5 million homes, that I think will do that. But I understand why the messages of the Greens and reforms, their quick answers, are appealing to a group of people who want change so quickly. I sympathise and understand that, but I don't think that's how we're going to get it.
The cost of living was a clear worry for some of our interviewees. In November's budget, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced a rise in the minimum wage for both 18 to 20s and over 21s, plus paid work placements for young people struggling to get employment. But one other recurring theme in our interviews was Labour's approach to immigration and refugees, which some saw as too harsh.
What I want is a fair and transparent immigration process. One of the main reasons that we're doing the things we're doing is stopping the boat crossings, trying to make sure that no one makes that very dangerous journey in the first place. But I think immigration policy is complicated. It's hard to explain sometimes the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. You know, partly maybe that's because we do need to go out there and speak to people who are concerned about it and explain it more. But on the same side, I mean, I represent a constituency where I would probably say concern about immigration is the number one issue that's brought up with me, both on the doorstep and in my inbox. I share some of their concerns. I really do.
Several of the young women we interviewed also said they wanted to hear more about tackling sexual harassment and sexual violence from a Labour government. There's a government commitment to halving violence against women and girls over a decade, but that didn't seem to be something they'd heard about. Is what you're doing cutting through?
It upsets me, actually, when I hear that young women would think that we're not doing enough on that, because I think we have done some really important things on this already. I mean, Jess Phillips has campaigned around these areas for years and years and years, and she is a really formidable person to have with this brief. We've introduced rape crisis into 999 call centres. We've also increased, in Kettering, they've opened a women's centre. That's something that I have campaigned for in my own constituency. There's things like this that I think probably you don't know about, unfortunately, until you need it. The Online Safety Act as well. But yes, of course, there's more to do.
The extent of the frustration, anxiety, and sometimes anger we've heard in our conversations left me wondering, why isn't this story more widely told? After all, young men voting for reform piqued the media's interest, resulting in TV debates, think pieces, and endless analysis about what was driving them. Why the comparative lack of curiosity in what's going on inside women's heads? I asked Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian, and a colleague, why some political trends seem to get more coverage than others.
I think that there was a feeling that what was happening on the right with that group of young voters, going in a different direction from the way that young people are perceived to vote. We all think that they go left and suddenly there's this group of young men, was part of coverage of sort of a wider phenomenon around sort of the rise of misogyny online, the rise of influencers like Andrew Tate. And it felt very immediate and very scary to a lot of people, including parents. I think there's also a point about the male gaze, which still exists across many media organisations, particularly because so many in this country are slightly slanted to the right. And that's only exacerbated by the fact that social media echo chambers on the right are very kind of male-dominated.
18 to 24-year-olds is quite a small group of voters. The Greens at the time were polling in single digits. Was there a feeling that it wasn't a big enough phenomenon to drive events, really, or to make a big change in the way British politics unfolds?
Yeah, and maybe, again, it's that whole thing about, for so long we've had a system that's been dominated by two mainstream parties, and now it looks like, that's broken down entirely, and we have like 5 parties really in England and 6 in Scotland and Wales, and that could lead to a completely different picture at the next election.
Pippa talked about the breakdown of the old two-party system we're seeing now, Labour and the Tories on the back foot, Reform leading the polls, the Green Party recording its highest ever poll share with both Ipsos and YouGov this autumn, and also claiming to have more members than the Liberal Democrats. Our young female voters now look like something of a canary down the mine, an early warning in July 2024 of what was coming. But where does the story go next? I asked Professor Rosie Campbell, if young women are moving further left in their 20s, how likely is that to last as they grow older?
I think it's very difficult to say now, because actually party allegiance is so transient now compared to the way it used to be. I mean, in the past, perhaps the first party you voted for would be the party you vote for the rest of your life. Parties cannot make that assumption anymore.
Women under 24 as a group are not enough to swing an election by themselves, and statistically less likely to vote than pensioners. So does that mean mainstream parties, to be blunt, can afford to ignore them? Pollster Scarlett Maguire.
I don't think they can afford to ignore it. And I would be incredibly worried, for example, if I was Labour, if I started seeing 18 to 24-year-old women vote en masse for the Green Party, because I wouldn't see there was any necessarily logic in them, in inverted commas, coming home. For young women, I think there's a perceived moral failure on the Labour Party. Now, that's on a range of issues. I'm thinking particularly on things like the conflict in the Middle East. And I think it's going to be really, really hard to win those voters back.
So far, Labour's strategy has been to argue that voting for smaller parties is a wasted vote because only Labour can really win a majority. But young women may take more convincing of that. Now polls suggest a narrowing of the gap between Labour and the Greens. So how much difference would it make if the Greens did overtake Labour in the polls at any point, as Reform have the Conservatives?
I think it would be hugely significant, and I think it's the most underpriced thing when we talk about the impact of what's going to happen in politics over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years. I think as soon as Labour aren't able to say a vote for the Green Party lets in Nigel Farage, or a vote for the Green Party means that you're going to get a right-wing government, that argument becomes much harder to make if you're polling second to them. And so I think firstly it means that we'll see much more fracturing on the left, exactly like happened with the Conservatives. But I think the other thing that we'll see is that the Labour Party, just like the Conservative Party were with Reform, will come under renewed pressure to sort of conduct their politics and their policies in a way that explicitly appeals to those voters.
So what would appeal to our young women?
Talk to a young woman, please. And not just one young woman, because my experience as a white woman is very different from someone who's not white.
People hold these stereotypical views of women, they're irrational, all of these things. So teach something else, show women who are empowering and who do amazing things.
Maybe if politicians started to actually change the narrative rather than just going along with what a lot of right-wing parties are saying, it would give me a lot more faith in politics.
Listening to these young women has felt like putting the missing pieces back into the jigsaw. While they might not swing an election, their votes last summer now look like an early warning of how British politics was about to splinter, with voters impatient for change, rejecting mainstream parties on both left and right, and the simultaneous rise of both the Greens and Reform, posing a complex challenge to Labour and to the Conservatives. Scarlett Maguire.
I think the seeds were sown for this at the last general election, and I think actually everyone was a bit slow on the uptake. I think there was quite a lot of complacency from the existing mainstream political parties, but also from all of us.
Understanding what's driving young women, from their economic prospects to their social media diet to their fear of an anti-feminist backlash, as well as what's driving young men, helps complete the picture of this anti-establishment surge. What happens as they grow older depends on whether politicians and our media are really paying attention. Because these young women aren't just part of the story. Increasingly, they will be shaping it.
And I think what we can safely say is there is no normal to return to. I think from now, things are only going to get weirder.
This is Dr. Chris. And doctors aren't here, and we are dropping in to let you know about our new BBC Radio 4 podcast. In What's Up, Docs, we are going to be diving into the messy, complicated world of health and well-being, because it can be confusing, can't it, Sant? That's right, Chris. The mass of information out there can be contradictory, it can be overwhelming, and Chris and I get confused too.
That's right, we get seduced by the marketing, the hype, the trends, so we want to be your guides through it. And I think it's fair to say, Sant, we are going to be getting personal.
We're absolutely going to be getting personal, Chris. What I want to do is bring in my own health dilemmas in the hope that we can help you with yours.
Listen and subscribe to What's Up, Docs on BBC Sounds.